Hello everyone, welcome to another video of one of my chess league matches. This game, played in the 4NCL with a 45-minute plus 15-second increment match, was played against a FIDE master who I've played twice before. First time we played, it was a drawn match, but then the second time we played, I got crushed. I played very, very badly, and he played very well. This game, I was trying to return the score to being 50% against him. He played e4, I started off with a Caro-Kann, d4, d5, and white can take, they can push the pawn, they can defend the pawn, or play f3. He chose to capture, and I take back, because I don't really want to bring my queen out too early and have it be attacked. c4, the Panov Botvinnik Caro-Kann, and then all I do generally is I bring out my two knights, which usually promises black fairly good play. White does normally have a small edge, but it's nothing to be too concerned with. They can trade, which I do like playing against. Knight f3 is a very common move, and it seems to be a move which doesn't challenge black too much, but it does still give white a very small edge. However, the FIDE master chose bishop to g5, where black has to know their lines quite well. Fortunately I do, because I played the Caro-Kann for a couple of years and played it almost exclusively. If I go a bit wrong, white can keep a large initiative, space advantage, and general good plan of attack. What I do is I capture the pawn, so immediately challenging white. If they take back with the bishop, usually you can take on d4. White has to address the d4 pawn being captured. So there is knight f3, which was played in the game, which I don't know that line as well, to be honest. I know the really critical lines. There's d5, which is interesting. And then I normally go knight to e5, so that I can keep the pawn a bit longer. And I'm not too worried about bishop takes c4. Even though it wins back the pawn after queen a4 check, I think that because I have the bishop pair, this shouldn't be too bad for black. So bishop d7 and queen takes c4. And I think I'm fine. Even rook c8 is quite good here in some positions. So d5 is quite critical. Knight a5 is an alternative after d5, but I prefer knight to e5. Bishop takes c4 is also an interesting move, where again black has to play fairly accurately. But after knight f3, I remembered that there was a book. I can't remember who wrote it now. I have forgotten. Possibly Peter Wells might have written about the Caro-Kann, maybe? I'm not... again, I can't remember. But I remember reading that h6 was a useful move, because what it does is it forces the white bishop to make a choice. If white drops back, I then follow up with g5, so bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and surprisingly enough, I can be very primitive about it and hold the pawn on c4. White's advantage is practically nothing now. In fact, black may even be better here. It's not easy to win back the pawn, and if I can keep it a bit longer, then I can probably hold it permanently, being a pawn up. So what h6 does is it forces the trade. I lose the integrity of my pawns, but I get active quickly, and I do get the bishop pair. He takes. Then I remembered that the bishop needed to move so I can castle. I did think about bishop e7, but it feels very passive. And if white puts in a check, I could always block with the queen if I need to. Then I was expecting castles here, which I think is, I expect, going to be the main line. And then I would castle, maybe play bishop g4 afterwards. But the attack on my knight came. My thinking was that I don't really like going backwards with knight e7. Knight a5 feels too positionally counterintuitive, because it's on the rim, on the edge of the board. Therefore, knight to e5 felt natural. If knight takes, I can take with a pawn to undouble myself, or even take with the bishop to gain better control of the board. Check, develop the piece, bishop d7, and castles. Well, I don't want to be left behind, I castle as well. Then he captures, and I could take with a knight in order to keep on more pieces, but overall I'm happy taking with the queen because it connects my rooks together, and if he takes off the knight trading a piece, I can always take back with the pawn, again leading to my pawn structure being fine. And his move h3 is possibly a little passive. I get the reason though, it stops knight g4 and queen g4, and also may free up squares for the king in case there's any checkmates way off in the future. So it's not a terrible move. I then figure that I need to have my rooks on open lines. My thinking was the knight on e5 doesn't want to move really, and if they take me on e5, I want to take back with the pawn. So the two open files for me are c8 and d8, with c8 being the most active file for my rooks. Then rook c1, and here I'm not totally sure my move was correct. Possibly rook fd8 is best. My thinking was that I may be able to get a kingside attack and also gain space and pressure my opponent with rook c4, with the idea being to play rook fc8 and also maybe even rook f4 or rook h4 in the future, and going for the king. Queen e2, with the minor threat of knight takes knight and then grabbing the free rook. I don't fall for it. I play rook fc8, improving my position with my rooks doubled up. Rook cd1 was a very nice move. It got out of the way, so the knight on c3 can now move without the rook that was on c1 being attacked. And I did think quite hard here, but I seem to have not found the right move. It turns out that taking the knight is actually strongest. But again, I want to keep the tension. I want him to take me. I tried to force it with queen to f5, and I did succeed. Knight takes. And then here I was in two minds, because taking with the pawn is, I'm sure, okay. My thinking, though, was that if I could trade queens as well, then my rooks and bishop would work very well together, and their rooks and knight would not work as well. So with the simple plan of threatening mate in one, and of having some minor tactics in the mix as well, I thought that white's best move was to take the queens off, which he does. Take back with the pawn, I've undoubled and got a small advantage. I do need to make sure, though, that the d5 pawn for white doesn't get too far up the board. If it gets to d7, and they can hold the pawn without me winning it back, then the tables may turn and white could have a big advantage. So rook fe1, improving the pieces, and I then spent a very long time here and played, I think, the third or fourth best move. So what would you play if you were black in this position? My thinking was that white had two interesting moves, knight b5 and knight e4 at some stage, then pushing on to d6 when I move the bishop. So my thought was, if I play f5, knight b5 happens, and if I play a6, knight e4. Best move apparently is king f8, marching in the king. But I played rook d8, so I guard the bishop and also try to hold back the d-pawn. White offers the trade, and I do trade and then play f5. So my thinking is that if white does take the bishop off and I take back with the rook, it's a rook and pawn ending where the d5 pawn, because it's fully blockaded, I may be able to win it later with my king coming up. And it's too far away from white's king for it to be fully reinforced. And isolated pawns usually get weaker the fewer pieces there are on the board in the ending. But on the other hand, white may want to take me because, again, rooks and knights are not usually cooperating as much as rooks and bishops. But he retreated because he holds the pawn. my thinking was I could perhaps play bishop to d4, blocking the rook from protecting the pawn, and also just easily having a stranglehold on the position. I would not be in danger of losing for quite a while. So king f1, bishop d4, bishop e2, king e2. And I can't see a way to win the pawn yet. If I take the knight, pawn takes back, and the rook is defending his pawn again. So there's no need to hurry here. I can trade later on. First I'll bring my king up. And here an annoying move. If I capture the pawn, and he takes back, and then I try to make a passed pawn somehow, even if I succeed, and we get something like this, then white has this knight on e4, which is really useful, and it's sort of blocking my e-pawn, and it controls the centre very effectively. This position obviously is not the best example, because rook takes d5 is playable, but that kind of idea is very annoying for me. So if white plays instead, maybe f3 might be good. Then yeah, h5 takes, and perhaps white just simply brings in the king d3, and then king to e4, which may be even more effective. Now the rook is off guard duty; it doesn't have to stay on the d file, and they may be able to play rook h1 or rook d2 to g2. Maybe I still have a slight edge, but I don't really think so. I think white's king is too powerful. So I don't want this to happen at all. I want to keep the structure working well. So I play g6 with the plan of keeping a pawn on f5, so e4 is no longer available for the white pieces. Rook d2, he's simply passing his turn. He wants to see what I'm doing. King f6, improving my king. a3, and what this did is it avoids a tactic that I had in mind. If white tries knight to b5, trying to go for the a-pawn and bishop, I would have played rook takes. Knight takes pawn is playable, because even if my bishop were to take the knight, my rook would drop at the end. So the idea behind this was to then play rook a5, going for the knight, forcing it back. And I had two plans here. One was to take the pawn on a2, which would be pretty good. And the other plan does revolve around trying to trap this knight on c8, with moves like king e6 and then king d7, which could be a possibility. However, the move a3 for white makes it so that rook takes a2 in that previous line is no longer an option. And I don't really want to have to figure out if I need to play king e7 first before being able to prevent knight b5. So I prevent it straight away with a6. This takes off any of white's tactics, where they could trade their terrible d-pawn for my a-pawn, which may be useful in the ending to have pawns on the edge of the board. So again, a pass of a turn, rook d3. And here, can you see the positional concept I use to keep the white d-pawn without any backup, win the pawn, and ideally win the game if I can convert. So how can I try to win the pawn? What I do is I now take the knight, finally. If rook takes bishop, I then take the pawn. So pawn takes, and I can't allow pawn c4. Then white may be fine. So b5. White could try playing a4, but possibly, I may even take it, but I think I would just leave my b-pawn where it was, to be honest, because they still won't be able to play c4 after the trade of a-pawns. So black takes, I again take, keeping my pawns together in the centre of the board. King e3, and finally I get to allow my king access to e5, running for the d-pawn. Push my king in, and here I missed the best move. After white played f4 check, I thought that I had to take it en passant, because otherwise, if I played king d6, I clearly can't take the pawn next turn, because the white rook would be protecting us and I'd lose the king. But it turns out I can pivot around with king d6, king c5, and then take the pawn, with the rook, and that gives me a clear win, or a clear advantage. But instead I took with the thought that I could then take on d5 anyway, have a passed f-pawn and be way better. But I may have misjudged it after rook h4, because now, if I defend the h-pawn, white has lots of counterplay with moves like rook with a pawn to c4 or pawn to a4, and enough pawn trades could lead to a draw. So I thought in the end I would take, white would take, and I'd then try to win the c-pawn. If the white king comes across to defend it, my f3 pawn runs up the board. So if I can win the c3 pawn, then the a3 pawn, then the h3 pawn, I'll be maybe 2 pawns up. So that should be enough. King f2, so I immediately take, thinking this is good. If rook takes a6, I think I'm clearly winning after king f4. And then I will play rook c2 and use my king, pawn, rook to promote. But instead, the FIDE master plays a4, which I had missed. The reasoning is that if I take, I have 4 doubled isolated pawns. And even though I'm 3 pawns up at that exact moment, I don't think I have enough to win. Because if rook takes a6, and say a3, then possibly just rook a4. And I don't really see how I'm making any kind of headway here. If I check with the rook, it'll take on f3, and then I'll only be 1 pawn up. And if I try to hold things and play sort of king over to g5, I'm not really sure how to, again, do anything. All white needs to do is just keep going back and forth. Potentially I might have pawn f4, trying to affect everything this way, but I didn't see this at the time. And even now, it's a bit complicated. So king takes, rook takes f4, and I now need to make a move. If I play a2, then rook to a4 should draw the match, I think. And if I play, say, rook b3, then white may be able to play rook a4. And we're in a very strange position where the black king is in Zugzwang, so it can't move, because rook h4 is mate. My a-pawn can't move because white will take it and be in a winning position, in a drawing position. And if I move the rook up to check, it takes on f3, and again I don't really see where I'm going. And the black king is in the wrong position. It should be on d3, for example. So I need to play this very accurately to not mess it up. So my thinking was rook a3. If black takes on a6, I can play pawn or rook takes on a4, keeping my 2 pawns up, but also having passed pawns that are easier to push. But he trades, which is fine. Then rook h4 to prevent me from doing anything. But funnily enough, now I create a Zugzwang, rook b3. And the white rook cannot stay on the 4th rank. Every single square will be dangerous for it, other than the one it's currently sitting on. But the pawn can't move, and the white king, if it moves, will allow pawn f4 check, or the rook to go to b2 without losing the f3 pawn. So he has to concede the square. King e4, using an idea in the Philidor defense. If white checks on e8, I go to f4, and if they check on h4, I push the pawn. So something will go to f4 if I get checked. Now, after h4, he can't check me on h4 anymore. So I was thinking of king f4, but first I thought force the enemy king back. King e3, threatening mate in 1, and he is able to stop me with a check. And stupidly, I thought that I could play king g3, because in my head I just hadn't realised his pawn had moved forward. So I had thought that because if his pawn was still on h4, I could play king g3, check, and then take the pawn, the white pawn, on h. But then I realised it was too far away, so that was rather silly. And he's coming back. If the b and the h pawn are traded, it may still be a draw, even though I'm 2 pawns up, because they're doubled up, and the white king is in the perfect place. So after rook h2, I did have a plan. He cannot take the pawn. If he does so, I would play king g3 and there are no checks. So now I can win with rook h1 mate, or f2 check if he plays king g1. And I promote. So rook b6. Again, if I take the pawn, then he can take on b, I think. Well, maybe not, but I didn't want to risk anything here. And my thinking was that if I go king g3, he can still put me in check. So I'll push b4, and what this will do is, if he takes it, then definitely king g3 will win. h6, I push again. King g1 to force me to make a decision. This was quite a clever move, which I'd missed this. If I play king g3, he can do a check, and then I'm losing. So I had to play accurate here. f2 check. King takes rook, I promote to a queen, and that should be enough to win. It's king f1. Then push one more time, push to b2. So I've got several threats simultaneously. For example, if rook takes pawn, my plan was rook h1. If the king doesn't take the pawn, I promote. So the king must take it, and then I can play rook h2 with a skewer, winning the rook and the game. So he plays rook b4 check. I go back to avoid all the checks now. h7. And then I was thinking, ooh, what do I do? Am I certain this is winning or not? And because I realized if I go rook h1 check, he can now take. Or at least I thought he could, because I thought if I take this pawn on h7, there's king g2, and then I can't prevent the b pawn dropping, and it should be a draw. So it's a clever idea. And if I promote, by the way, he'll take, I'll take, and then his pawn promotes to a queen, so I'd then be on the losing side, I expect. So what I did in the game was I played rook takes pawn. He now needs to take something. So he did king g2, which is another clever sidestep. If he had done rook takes pawn, just like in the game, I can just like in the earlier example, I can check. And if king takes f2, I would have done rook h1, threatening to promote. So he has to take, and then again get the skewer, winning the match. But he played the trickiest move, which was king g2, and then I think there are probably several moves that win. Rook h1 may even win, but to avoid all complications, I played f1 queen, and he then resigned, which was a critical match because that on that hinged the whole game, because essentially the score was, I think we were losing 1.5-1/2, and on our other board that was still continuing, we were winning that match. So that would have tied the scores at 1-1 or 1.5-1. And then if this game had been drawn, it would have been a 2-2 draw. And if he'd have won, their team would have won. And if I'd have won, which I did, then our team would have won the match. And did win. So f1 queen forces resignation because king takes is the only move. And then I was going to play another queen on b1. And just like earlier, rook h1 at the end, forcing a skewer and winning the match. So I thought the game was definitely interesting. I had thought I'd played really well, and then of course when I turn on the computer analysis, there are tons of small errors and a couple of blunders here and there. But I don't think I was ever really in a huge amount of danger in that game. I thought the opening went well for black. Then the middle game, perhaps I had a very small edge because I had the bishop against knight. And then the ending, I simply felt like I was better because of the white pawn. Despite it being a passed pawn, it was isolated and it was too close to the black pieces, so I was able to round up and win the pawn. And essentially I'm doing what they call playing for two results. It's either going to be a draw or I'm going to win. Unless I really blunder, I'm not going to lose the match. So I like playing on in those positions, and that's the reason I declined a draw offer sent when it was still roughly equal, but I thought I had a small edge. Because I knew that there's no way I'll lose, so I may as well try and win. So I hope you enjoyed the video. The next match in this league that I'll be playing is in a fortnight's time, but I will be playing next Tuesday in a congress, the spring 4NCL Spring Congress. So I'll be uploading a video about that as well. See you next time. Bye.